So let's get into early socialism. Socialism prior to Karl Marx and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. So some of the early socialists are Henry de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, Louis Blanc, Louis-Auguste Blanqui. And then you have the Ricardian Socialists, John Francis Bray, John Gray, Thomas Hodgkin. So these pre-modern socialists can be thought of as proto-socialists. This early socialism had a lot of ideas that influenced the development of socialism later, but they were not. It was not a fully developed socialism like modern socialism. They tended to advocate a lot of conflicting things that didn't have a whole lot to do with socialism as advocated by other people that were identifying as socialists at the time. So there wasn't any unifying vision amongst these people, and it would have been really hard to actually define socialism at that time. But modern socialists have been heavily influenced by their ideas. Some of the notable ideas, I'm just going to run through them. Saint Simon had this idea that industrial organization would ultimately supplant governmental organization. Economic organization would supersede and replace political organization. And this is related to the Marxist ideal of the withering away of the state. This idea that government would eventually be replaced by economic organization or industrial organization is a common theme running through socialism. Then you have Louis Blanc. He called for the creation of cooperatives to guarantee employment for the urban poor. And as far as I know, he was the first person to advocate a job guarantee program or to put forth the idea of government as the employer of last resort. Then you have Louis-Auguste Blanqui. He thought that social change could only be brought about by violent revolution. He didn't really see any role for the proletariat or the working class in this revolution, but instead he thought that, or he envisioned a small group of revolutionary conspirators organizing a coup and seizing power. Then they would establish a temporary tyranny in order to install a new form of government. And that's how socialism would come about in his thought. Then you have Charles Fourier. He saw poverty as the chief cause of social disorder. He thought that concern and cooperation were the keys to fixing the social problem. He also regarded trade as being kind of inherently evil. Then you have Robert Owen. Owen started the cooperative movement and really influenced the trade union movement. He was the first person to advocate an 8-hour workday, and he actually coined the slogan 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. And an interesting fact about Robert Owen is that in 1825 he addressed the U.S. Congress to espouse his vision of utopia and announce his plan to undertake a utopian socialist experiment in New Harmony, Indiana. Um, and among the people in attendance at when he gave this address were Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. Um, um, Among the early socialists, you also had Auguste Comte. He founded praxeology, or the study of human action. He was a thinker in the early philosophy of science. He advocated positivism, the idea that any justifiable position could be logically or mathematically proven. He saw the development of the physical sciences and thought that the development of a new social science was inevitable. He thought that you could have a social and economic science that was basically akin to physics. Then you had the Ricardian Socialists, these like Thomas Hodgkin, John Francis Bray, John Gray. These guys came out of the classical liberal tradition. Uh, they really carried classical liberalism to its logical conclusion. They took the ideals of David Ricardo and they used them as a justification for advocating cooperative ownership of industry. And it should be noted that among the classical liberals, John Locke, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, there was already advocacy of land value tax, or the collection of ground rent for public purposes. And this can be seen as a form of public ownership of land. Uh, so the idea of public ownership was already there in classical liberalism, and Ricardian socialism was just basically the idea that should be extended beyond just land to the ownership of industry in general. So now we're to Marxism. Marx synthesized these various proto-socialist positions, creating a more unified vision of socialism. All of the proto-socialist ideas that I mentioned above, all of these proto-socialist ideas that I've mentioned are basically combined into one and revamped to create a new, more coherent vision of socialism. Um, so we'll start with talking about Marx's analysis of how capitalism came about. And we'll start with the primitive accumulation of capital. Marx starts with an analysis of how capitalism came about. It started with historically there was the commons. There was this land that anybody could use for whatever they needed it. There wasn't private ownership of land as we have today. People, fields, farmlands were owned in common. People could go to the common lands and put they could build a shack or a house and acquire that through usufructuary arrangements, and nobody was excluded from access to the land. But with the emergence of feudalism, the government came in and enclosed the common lands. In England, a lot of the commons were technically regarded as the property of the church and monasteries, but these were lands that were freely available for anybody to use. And the government came in and closed off these lands and gave them to private individuals, usually military leaders, and they this allowed those individuals that were now the owners of that land to start charging rent for access to the land. So you had these people that were farming the land, that had been farming the land all along, and now all of a sudden nothing has changed in the nature of the case. These are still the same people working the land, but suddenly they have to pay tribute to this absentee landlord for in order to be able to work the land and continue living the way that they always have. And what this did is it allowed for there to be this class of landlords, these individuals who weren't producing anything, that could just live off of these rent payments they were receiving from someone else. So you had these people working the land, and they had to pay rent or pay tribute to the landowners. So you had this idle class of landowners develop. And as far as Marx is concerned, capitalism is essentially just feudalism repackaged. What feudalism allowed for, though, is the primitive accumulation of capital. It allowed for there to develop large stocks of money in the hands of these individuals that were historically landlords. The landlords are receiving rent from the people that are living on the land and farming the land, and these rent payments are accumulating, and that is eventually what allows for the Industrial Revolution. You have these big stocks of money that people can afford to go into these big industrial pursuits and start paying people to do work for them in factories and stuff. So feudalism kind of laid the foundation for capitalism by allowing for the primitive accumulation of capitalism to take place. Then what happens with the emergence of capitalism is you start seeing more a shift to industrialism, and you have factory production, and factory production is being carried on in a socialistic manner or a social manner. It's being done collectively. These people are working together to produce stuff. But the form of accumulation is still individualistic. Still, it's You've got all these people working collectively to produce wealth, to produce goods in the factories and in the workshops, yet there are private owners that are accumulating all the wealth. So Friedrich Friedrich Engels, he sees this as an inherent contradiction within capitalism, and he talks about this in his essay "Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific." Um, and he makes the case that capitalistic production is inherently inherently self-contradictory, because you have collective production coupled with private accumulation or private appropriation. So you have private property alongside collective production of wealth. Then you have this. Marx had this idea of the anarchy of production. So producers under these new mercantilist conditions had no way of knowing all the relevant facts related to production, distribution, and demand. So in supplying any commodity, the producer knows neither how much needs to be produced in order to meet demand, nor how much of the same commodity is being produced elsewhere by other producers. There is no economic coordination for production and distribution between the various producers. This was a relatively small problem as long as production tended to be done by individuals working in relative isolation. But with the new accumulation of capital and the shift towards the capitalistic mode of production, which is to say producing things in mass in centralized factories through collective effort, this lack of coordination between various producers led to widespread overproduction and a general disequilibrium of supply and demand. And this caused economic recessions. This lack of coordination amongst producers is what Marx called the anarchy of production. If the various producers coordinated their actions in a rational way, they could avoid overproduction, and the tragedy of the business cycle that is inherent in the capitalist system could be avoided. The state, therefore, according to Marx, should renounce its dogma of laissez-faire, and it should intervene in the market by taking over industry and coordinating production and distribution in a rational manner, hence central planning. Marx also had this idea of surplus value, and this idea is associated with Marx, but as far as I know, it was actually Proudhon who was the first to recognize this. Surplus value is the excess value produced by workers beyond what they get paid. It's the difference between the cost of keeping workers alive, their wages, and the value of the final product that they produce. This excess wealth produced by the workers goes to the capitalists in the form of profit. All labor produces surplus value because there is always a difference between the objective value of things reflected in the cost of production and the subjective value of things reflected in the amount of money which the consumer is willing to pay for the product. But there is also a certain type. There is also a certain type of surplus value that stems from collective organization, or from producing things socially or collectively. Uh, uh, so 10 people working on a single task are not only able to accomplish the task faster, but can actually accomplish things that an individual can't do by themselves no matter how much time they have. Um, there may be an object that is so big that one person cannot possibly move it by themselves. Even if you give them an infinite amount of time, they cannot do it. But at the same time, 10 people working together may be able to accomplish that task easily and do it in basically no time at all. So the value produced by collective effort is not equivalent to merely adding together the value produced by each individual on their own. Collectively, they produce more value than each individual's contributions combined. So, those ideas, the primitive accumulation of capital, surplus value, the anarchy of production, those are things you should keep in mind throughout the rest of this. So now we're to the Communist Manifesto. So the Communist Manifesto predicted the worsening of the condition of the working class. There's this idea of the immiseration of the proletariat. Immiseration basically means impoverishment. In the competitive quest to maximize profits, wages will be forced down further and bosses will cut corners on safety. This will continue until wages are so low and working conditions are so harsh that the working class has no choice but to rise up and take over. The proletariat or the working class will inevitably rise up and take over the government in a violent revolution, and they will establish what Marx calls a dictatorship of the proletariat. They will impose socialism, that is, public ownership of the means of production, and they will carry out the rational organization of production and distribution. Rational planning will supplant the anarchy of production. The purpose of the state, as far as Marx is concerned, the purpose of the state is to protect the status of the ruling class and help keep them in power. With the imposition of socialism, the distinction between classes will wither away, and the state will lose its reason for existence. The state, becoming obsolete, will eventually wither away. And with the rational organization of production and distribution through central planning, markets will eventually become obsolete. The market and free trade are distribution mechanisms, and an efficiently planned economy will have no need for them. So socialism, public ownership, and central planning will then eventually give way to communism, a stateless, moneyless economy. Production will become more and more automated, the necessity of labor will diminish, and the line between work and play will fade away. People will be liberated from the necessity of toil. So that's basically an outline of the predictions made by the Communist Manifesto. And now I just want to run through the 10-point platform put forth by the Communist Manifesto. First, there is the abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Second, the heavy progressive or a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3, abolition of all right of inheritance. 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the provision of the soil generally, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. 8, equal obligation of all to work. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country, or of a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. And finally, 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. So those are the 10 points of the platform of the Communist Manifesto. The book recommendation for this video is The Communist Manifesto by Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. And also I want to recommend the essay Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by Engels. It's worth reading.